Hello there, how are you doing? My name is Mutiaba Conrad, and I'm going to be taking you through banking law. And today we are going to be looking at a topic known as nature of the relationship of banker and a customer. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you're able to get all my audios and videos every time I release them. So basically today, like I said, we are going to look at the nature of the relationship of a banker and a customer. And under this, we are going to be looking at a number of principles. And the first principle today we are going to look at under the nature of the relationship of a bank and a customer is that the relationship of a banker and his or her customer is one of a contract. So please always remember that the moment we are talking about the nature of the relationship between a bank and a customer, the governing principle or one of the key principles is that the relationship of a banker and his or her customer is one of a contract. Very important to note. This principle was further fortified in the case of Sudan Commercial Bank versus El Sadiq Mohammed El Sadiq, and this is a case of 1967, volume 1 ALR Com 35. So in that case, the Court of Appeal of Sudan stated that the relationship of a banker to a customer is one of a contract. So very important principle to note governing the nature of the relationship of a bank and a customer. Also, of interest is the case of Esco Petroleum Company versus Uganda Commercial Bank, a case reported, it's Civil Appeal number 14 of 1992. Now, in this case, the Supreme Court of Uganda has held that the relationship of a banker and a customer is of a contractual nature. So that principle has been emphasized in those two cases. Now, the second principle governing the nature of the relationship between a bank and a customer is that the relationship of a banker and a customer is that of a contract. It is an implied contract whose terms are not written but dependent on the custom of bankers. So very important to note. So the import of this section is that whereas this relationship is of contract, okay, but it is an implied contract and the terms are not written, but rather they depend on the custom of the bankers. Of interest to fortify further this point is the case of Rendall. Rendall is Rendall, Rendall Day versus Republic. This is a case of 1967, volume 3, ALR COMM, page 17. Now, in that case, court stated that when a person pays money into his or her bank account, that money becomes the property of the bank. The relationship between a banker and a customer becomes that of a debtor and creditor, with the addition that the banker promises to honor the customer's checks on demand. So very important point there to note, and it goes on to support the principle which I earlier stated for you. So please always note that whenever a customer pays money into his or her bank account, that money becomes the property of the bank, and the relationship between the bank and the customer becomes that of a debtor and a creditor, with the addition that the banker or the bank promises to honor the customer's checks on demand. So that's also the other principle governing the nature of the relationship. But whereas that is the position, it's also very important to note the principle that money paid into a bank ceases altogether to be the money of the principal, and that principle applies solely on the relationship between the banker and the customer and does not affect the right of a third party to recover money paid into a bank and a mistake. So that principle is very paramount, okay? That whereas the money paid by a customer becomes the property of the bank, however, the Supreme Court of Ghana, in the case of Attorney General of Ghana versus Bank of West Africa Limited, which is reported in 1965, ALR COMM 214 at page 220. The Supreme Court of Ghana went on to say that, yes, there is that general principle, okay, that money paid into a bank ceases altogether to be the money of the principal, okay. But however, court went on to guide and said that that principle applies only or solely to the relationship between a bank and a customer. It does not affect the right of a third party to recover money paid into a bank under a mistake of fact. So meaning that the exception to this principle is as to the third parties. So where a third party, okay, pays money onto an account of a bank, okay, by virtue of a mistake of fact, then that principle, as earlier stated, in the case of Rendell Day versus Republic, would not in the circumstances apply. Now, those are some of the principles, but it's also important to note that although the bank is usually the debtor, as we have seen, it may also happen that the customer becomes the debtor. It is possible that a customer can be the debtor, okay? Under which circumstances, let's say maybe where the bank has lent such a customer money, he can, for example, become a debtor. Therefore, the relationship of a debtor and creditor is not always fixed. It can change. In some respects, it can be the bank, which is the debtor, and in other respects, it can be the customer who is a debtor. Okay, very important to note. Now, part of the banker's business is to borrow and lend money. Now, since that is part of his business, then can it be said that the banker is a money lender? Since, anyway, a banker's main role or one of his key roles is to lend money. Can it be said, therefore, that a banker is a money lender? Now, a banker and a money lender have so much in common, okay? Because a money lender, his primary role is to give out money to a borrower. And that is also one of the primary roles of a bank, okay? Now, can it be said, therefore, that a bank is a money lender? We are going to examine this a little bit further. Well, yes, there are similarities, but there are also so many distinguishing aspects. Now, a bank and a money lender, like we said, although they have similar aspects, but the main distinguishing feature between a banker and any other borrower who undertakes to pay on demand is that for the banker, the demand or repayment is made against a written order or mandate which is exemplified by a check. Now, here what we are trying to say is that for a bank, okay, one of the distinguishing features between a bank and a money lender is that for a bank, money is paid, okay, when a written order is made, okay, by way of a check. Now, this is very well illustrated when you look at the under the law, okay, specifically if you look at the Bill of Exchange Act, okay, it's very clear. Now, when you look at section 1, okay, of the Bill of Exchange Act, Cap 68, it actually attempts to define what is a bill of exchange. Subsection 1 of that section, subsection 1 of section 1 actually defines a bill of exchange as an unconditional order in writing addressed by one person to another, signed by the person giving it, requiring the person to whom it is addressed to pay on demand or at a fixed or determinable future time a sum certain in money to or to the order of a specified person or to a bearer. Now, what basically that section is saying, it attempts to define what a bill of exchange is. And the bill of exchange which operates by way of a check, operates in a manner that the bank will only pay, okay, where you require it, okay, on demand to pay at a certain time, okay. For example, you write a check and you say that maybe my bank called X should pay Justin maybe 2 million shillings at a certain time, okay. Now, remember, you are the debtor, okay, and now you are the creditor, And you, the creditor, you're asking the bank which is holding your money, which then becomes the debtor, you're asking it to pay someone at a certain time. You're actually demanding it to pay. Now, that aspect distinguishes a bank from a money lender. Now, with a money lender, it's actually different. It's the opposite. Because remember, where there is a relationship of a customer and a money lender, in such a situation, it is the money lender who is the creditor, and then the borrower is actually the debtor. Now, normally it is not the debtor, okay, who requires now the money lender to pay. So it is actually the opposite, and this is the distinguishing aspect. Now, the aspect of a check cannot be drawn on any other borrower. Okay, that's a very key distinguishing feature between a banker and a money lender or any other borrower. So that's point number one. Okay, point number two is also under the principle that the law of the general debtors, okay, is that the debtor must look for his or her creditor and pay him or her. Okay, that's the general law, that's the general principle. Okay, that a debtor will look for his creditor and pay him or her. Now, in the case of a banker as a debtor, there is no obligation on the part of the particular debtor to seek out its creditor and pay him or her. The bank does not have that duty or that obligation. Okay. For example, when you keep your money with the bank becomes the debtor. You are the creditor. Okay, because you're keeping your money with the bank, so the bank has a debt. Okay, because it holds your money. Okay. Now, the bank has no duty or obligation to look for you, okay, and give you your money, even when it's your money. It is you who has to go to the bank and you get your money. Now, that is it's a distinguishing feature, okay, between a bank and a money lending agreement, okay, or the difference between a bank and a money lender. For a money lender, it is actually it is actually the who? It's actually because here we have seen that a bank has no duty. It is you who goes to the bank, whereas the bank is the debtor. Now, in a money lending agreement, the customer is the debtor, okay, and that debtor has a duty to look for the money lender to pay back their money, okay. So you quickly realize that there is a difference. For money lenders agreements, it's the debtor looking for the creditor. For a bank, it is actually the creditor looking for the debtor, because it's the customer who looks for the bank, okay, to get their money. It's not the other way round. So that's a very important distinguishing feature. And to fortify that position or that distinguishing feature, I invite you to look at the case of Osawaye versus National Bank of Nigeria Limited. And this is a case of 1973, volume 3, ALRCOMM, page 116. Now, in that case, it was said that the relationship of bank and customer is one of debtor and creditor, with the additional feature that there is no obligation on the part of the banker as debtor to seek out its creditor. Now, the customer and to seek out the creditor or the customer and pay him or her. Its obligation is only to pay the customer or some person nominated by the customer when the customer makes a demand or gives direction for payment. So this is what I was trying to illustrate, and this is the principle as was held out in that case, that a bank does not have an obligation, even when it is the debtor. It has no obligation to look for you and give you your money. It is you who has that obligation to go and pick your money, or if instructed, okay, by way of a bill of exchange or a check, then it can give your money to another person. Very, very important distinguishing aspect between a bank and any other borrower, or for purposes of our discussion, a money lender. Now, another distinguishing feature, which is actually the third one, okay, this is the third distinguishing feature, and indeed it makes up the nature of the relationship of a banker and a customer. So we are looking at these as distinguishing features between a banker and a moneylender, or any other borrower. But these principles also form the nature of the relationship between a bank and a customer. So the third distinguishing feature is the future, because you see, under Ugandan law, okay, and this indeed forms the other distinguishing feature, is that in Uganda, money lenders, okay, or money lending agreements are governed by the Tier 4 Microfinance Institutions and Money Lenders Act of 2016, okay. Now, that act does not apply to banks. When you look at banks, banks are predominantly governed by the Financial Institutions Act of 2004. Okay, very important to note. That is the regulation, and indeed this forms the other distinguishing aspect. Okay, money lenders are governed by the Tier 4 Microfinance Institutions and Money Lenders Act of 2016, whereas banks are predominantly governed by the Financial Institutions Act of 2007. Now, when you look under the Act, which is the microfinance, the Tier 4 Microfinance Institutions and Money Lenders Act, you will also quickly realize that actually these money lenders, okay, are even governed by a different body. Okay, they are governed by a different body. And when you look at specifically section 4, okay, section 5 of the Tier 4 Microfinance Institutions and Money Lenders Act, it actually shows, it provides for the authority. And the authority means the Uganda Microfinance Regulatory Authority established by section 6. So, for money lenders, they are governed by the authority, which is the Uganda Microfinance Regulatory Authority. Whereas banks are actually governed by the Bank of Uganda. Okay, so banks are governed by the Central Bank of Uganda, whereas money lenders are governed by the Uganda Microfinance Regulatory Authority under the law. So this is also another distinguishing feature. Then also, the other distinguishing feature is that the banks actually, as a requirement of the law, if a bank is to set up business, it must include the term bank as part of its name. And whereas when you look at these money lenders, they actually cannot use the word bank. So I invite you to look at section 7 of the Financial Institutions Act of 2004, and specifically section 7 subsection 1. It provides that no person other than a person licensed as a commercial bank, a merchant bank, a mortgage bank, or a post office bank under the law shall, except with the consent of the central bank, use the word bank. So, meaning that the word bank can only be used by a bank. It can't be used by a money lender. And actually, when you go on and look at section 7 of the same act, subsection 3, it prohibits any company to carry on business as a commercial bank or merchant bank or a mortgage bank or post office savings bank unless it uses as part of its name the word bank or one of its derivatives. So it is a requirement that banks must use the word bank. And unless you are a licensed bank, you cannot go on to use the word bank because it would be deceptive in a way. So basically, that is those are basically the nature. That is the nature of the relationship of a banker and a customer. So you just have to know the fundamental principles that as pertains the nature of the relationship of a bank and a customer, it's governed by a number of principles. The first principle is that the relationship of a banker and his or her customer is one of a contractual nature. Have at the background of your mind the case of Sudan Commercial Bank versus El Sadiq Mohammed El Sadiq. Also, interest yourself on the case of Esco Petroleum Company versus Uganda Commercial Bank. Then, the other important principle to note by way of recap is that the relationship of a bank and a customer, though is contractual, it is an implied contract whose terms are not written but dependent on the custom of the bankers. I directed you to look at the case of Rendell Day versus Republic. Then also of interest to note is that whereas this relationship is of a contractual nature, but rather a customer does not affect, that relationship rather does not affect the right of a third party to recover money paid into a bank under a mistake of fact. Then we also went on to pose a question as to whether the relationship between a banker and a moneylender or any other borrower is actually similar. And we said yes, there are a lot of similarities between a bank and a moneylender. But even when there are some similarities, they are quite very distinct features that distinguish a banker from a moneylender. We looked at a number of them. And one of the most distinguishing features was the fact that for a banker, money can be paid on demand by way of a check. I invited you to look at the Bills of Exchange Act, which defined that money can be issued out where a check is granted. And we went on to conclude that point by saying that a check cannot be drawn on any other borrower, meaning there is no any other person that can use a check. Okay, very, very important to note. Then we also went on to give the general law for governing debtors, which is that a debtor must look for his or her creditor and pay him or her. However, we say that in the case of a banker, as a debtor, there is no obligation on the part of the particular debtor to seek out its creditor and pay him or her. That was the second distinguishing feature. Then lastly, we went on to say that another key distinguishing feature is that in Uganda, basically moneylenders or money lending agreements are governed by the Tier 4 Microfinance Institutions and Moneylenders Act of 2016, whereas banks are regulated by the Financial Institutions Act of 2004. We also went on to say that for someone to have a bank, they must actually use the term bank when they are licensed. And that we also stated that under Section 7, subsection 3, unless you are a bank, you are not allowed to use the term bank, for example, if you're a money lender. We also looked at the regulatory bodies, and we said that financial institutions or banks are predominantly regulated by the Bank of Uganda, whereas these money lenders are actually regulated by the Uganda Microfinance Institution. These are very different regulatory bodies for each of those two different investment vehicles. So basically that was it in our discussion today. We have competently looked at the nature of the relationship between a banker and a customer. Thank you very much for listening in today's class. Please don't forget to like and share and comment in case you have any questions or you'd require me to make you any class on a certain topic of interest. Please, you can always comment in the comment bar. Thank you very much for listening in. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you're always able to get notifications when I release any classes on any topics that could be of your interest. Thank you very much for listening in. My name is Mutiaba Conrad. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.